If there are enemies of all of us trying to gain control over health, it's people in pharma, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical device industry. It's doctors who put profit and revenue ahead of actually giving you useful advice. It's the healthcare system, hospital systems, all the people who are essentially bankrupting the U.S. economy as well as your health. So those are the people we should put our crosshairs on and attacking. That is, attacking, exposing the perverted practices of the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, pharmacy benefit plans that add another layer of costs, often thousands of dollars per month to some drugs like biologics. So you know that this is a mess, and those are the people we should be criticizing and exposing. What we shouldn't do too much of, at least me, is exposing what's going on in the influencer space, book authors, bloggers, podcasters, etc. But I'm going to make an exception today because I've seen some big mistakes. If it's a mistake in nutrition that maybe got you a little fatter, well, okay, it's not that big a deal, right? But what if they're mistakes that kill you, that cause you to die? Well, now we got to talk about those kinds of things. This really came to light about a few years back. When there was a collection of products called ketone salts. So for years, the only form of exogenous ketones, like in a ketogenic diet, you can take ketones and get some of the benefits of ketones by taking them orally. Well, ketone esters were the only thing available for many years, but they were gross. It was awful. It tastes like petroleum. Well, then a collection of ketone salts came out. And so this is salts like a salt of beta-hydroxybutyrate. So it's coupled to a positively charged mineral like calcium, magnesium, sodium, or potassium to make it water-soluble and ingestible. And they got around the awful taste of the ketone esters. So these ketone salts quickly became popular. Well, one company in California chose to use almost exclusively potassium. So it was the potassium salt of beta-hydroxybutyrate and other ketones. Well, I got a hold of this product because I was a little bit suspicious this may not have been safe, and I did a simple calculation, and it became clear that if someone took this product of ketone salts, coupled mostly with potassium, and did only two doses per day for about 2 weeks, they would die of hyperkalemia, excessive potassium. Anyone who's worked in a coronary care unit or an intensive care unit or the emergency room knows that when you have hyperkalemia, there's a bunch of things that can cause high levels of potassium, and it's an emergency. If your potassium level, your blood potassium level, say, is 6.3, you may be just moments away from sudden cardiac death. Your heart stops and you have to be resuscitated, and even then it's hard because that level of potassium continues to make your heart rhythm unstable. So we know that hyperkalemia is very dangerous, and this one ketone salt product, too enriched in potassium, would be fatal within about 2 weeks of consumption. So these are people like bodybuilders and athletes who want to jack up their performance, and you'd find them dead if they took this product. So I called the CEO of the company. I contacted the FDA, and thankfully the product was immediately yanked. I never heard more from the FDA because they typically don't communicate with you. They just acknowledge, and that's the end of it. But thankfully that product was taken off. But here's an example of a well-intended product that got it so wrong that there could have been, who knows, dozens, hundreds of young people, young healthy people found dead of hyperkalemia and sudden cardiac death. So that's when we have to speak up, right? When things like that happen, when well-intended influencers, book authors, bloggers, whatever, give you bad advice because they didn't understand an issue completely. So let's talk about some of the other blunders being made. Not because I want to pick on these people, but because I want you to be safe and not fall victim to some new shiny thing that's exciting and then something bad happens to you. Another good example is cold water immersion. So a lot of people are advocating that you put yourself in an ice-cold bath, like a tub filled with ice cube, or maybe your bathtub filled with ice cubes, and you stay there for 15, 20 minutes. And they say it's safe, and you do it for increased clarity, concentration, motivation, and energy. And they say don't make it longer than 15, 20 minutes because you could get hypothermic. That is, your body temperature could drop, which becomes dangerous. But that's not the risk. That's only a risk if you stay in the water too long. The risk is sudden cardiac death within the first typically 3 minutes or so, sometimes almost immediate. The reason for that is primarily the coronary arteries, that is the heart's arteries, in some people are prone to spasm. And when a coronary artery spasms, it closes. We saw this all the time in the emergency room. A woman, it's typically a woman by the way, comes into the ER having a heart attack. Chest pain, can't breathe, EKG shows she's having a heart attack. They run the so-called cardiac enzymes that are just, it's heart tissue in the bloodstream that you're damaged because you're damaging your heart, like a CKMB, a creatine kinase MB, or troponin, and some others. So the woman's clearly having a heart attack. One of the first things that are done in ERs is give that person nitroglycerin. Could be sublingual, could be topical paste, could be intravenous. And it often aborts the heart attack. Oh, she feels better. The EKG, the ST segments come down, right? We still take her to the cath lab, take an angiogram of her heart's arteries. Well, the arteries are wide open. Well, where'd the heart attack come from? What artery closed and almost killed this woman? Well, the way to find out is you inject something that provokes spasm. This usually acetylcholine. That's a natural provoker of spasm. So we inject a microscopic dose of acetylcholine, and the artery that was causing the heart attack will suddenly close. It's terrifying because the woman once again starts to have a heart attack. Sometimes she has a cardiac arrest right on the cath lab table. We have to resuscitate her, put her on a ventilator, all that kind of stuff. But you now know why she had a heart attack, because she had coronary spasm. So that's a woman. If she fell for this nonsense of cold water immersion, would likely die within the first few minutes of getting in that water. This has been well established. This is not my speculation, by the way. For instance, ships that sail the North Atlantic, someone will fall overboard. You throw them a lifesaver, but they can often die within the first few minutes. Not from hypothermia, from coronary spasm. So we know this, that cold water exposure can be fatal within minutes, and it has nothing to do with hypothermia. Another big blunder being made in the influencer, blogger, etc. space is bone broth. So bone broth, of course, taking the bones of whatever meats, could be chicken, turkey, beef, pork, whatever, and you boil the bones for an extended period, typically 36 hours. Many add not just salt, but also vinegar to help extract some of the minerals, especially calcium and magnesium. And people use this and they believe it's really good for them because it's a source of collagen and those minerals. Problem: when you boil for an extended period, especially when you add vinegar, you also mobilize the lead, the heavy metal lead, because bone tissue in all of us, humans and animals, tends to concentrate lead. And this process you're using to make bone broth mobilizes and releases the lead. And we now have at least 2 studies showing that bone broths, whether it's homemade or made in a factory, tends to have very high levels of lead, sufficient to be a threat to your long-term health. Regulatory authorities say there is no level of lead intake that is safe, and the intake from bone broth is fairly high. So we don't make bone broth. You can make what I call the very unappetizing carcass broth. For instance, you bake a chicken, you eat what you want, the meat, whatever, save what else you have. Some of the bones, but more so ligaments, tendons, any remnants of meat, any organs that you happen to have, and boil it not for a long time, maybe 3-4 hours. Don't add vinegar, because the vinegar doubles the lead content. You will get a little bit of lead, but you get more of the nutrients, and of course it's delicious. So that's a way to use your food, get delicious soups and broths without the threat of high levels of lead. How about ketogenic and carnivorous diets? The thing that lulls people with those diets is that they do it and good things happen, right? A lot of food intolerances recede, they lose abdominal fat, their waists shrink, markers like triglycerides and blood glucose and blood pressure drop. They feel great, right? So a lot of gastrointestinal complaints go away. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is many people, not everybody, but many people who engage in those diets fail to get the fibers that nourish microbes in the gastrointestinal tract. So imagine you had your dog tied out in the backyard and you forgot to feed it, and it's chained, right, to a stake. What's going to happen to the dog after, say, 5 days? It's going to die. Same thing happens to the microbes in your gastrointestinal tract. Many microbes are reliant on the fibers from plants. Plants such as legumes, other root vegetables, onions, garlic. So if you cut those things out or get insufficient quantities of them, you starve many microbial species. So what happens in those diets is there's a dramatic loss of multiple species, hundreds of species. There's a reduction in the diversity, number of various species in the gastrointestinal tract, and you also allow the excessive proliferation of selected species, most commonly Akkermansia. Akkermansia's full name is Akkermansia muciniphila, mucus lover. So Akkermansia thrives on those fibers from foods, but if you deprive Akkermansia of those fibers, it starts to consume human mucus. So it's unique in that way. It can live on human mucus, your mucus, and that causes inflammation of the intestinal wall, can even lead to ulcerative colitis. It can inflame the small intestinal wall and open the door for endotoxemia, that is, the entry of bacterial breakdown products into the bloodstream. When that happens, you've increased your risk for such phenomena as higher blood glucose, blood pressure, depression, anxiety, skin rashes, heart problems, atrial fibrillation, coronary disease, coronary plaque rupture, all kinds of problems. That process, though, takes typically longer than a year to develop. So you can see what happens. You go on a ketogenic diet or a carnivorous diet, good things happen up front. You think this is fantastic, this is the way to go, until things start to go wrong. Typically 12 to 18 months into the program. You regain the weight. Triglycerides go up. Blood pressure goes up. You get constipated or get diarrhea. And if you did a stool analysis, you'd see major disruptions. And long term, you're setting yourself up for such things as diverticular disease and probably even colon cancer. Another common mistake, avoid foods containing oxalates. So oxalates or oxalic acid are naturally occurring components of plant foods. But oxalates are highest in foods such as spinach and kale and cocoa. Well, some people have come to believe that oxalates cause problems, and they can cause problems, especially calcium oxalate kidney stones, thereby kidney disease, and they may also bind minerals in your gut, making them unavailable. So calcium, magnesium, and others are unavailable for absorption. And there's some other problems with oxalates. So many people have come to believe that a low oxalate diet is necessary. Not true. The reason why people have problems with oxalates is because as a society, we have introduced major disruptions of our gastrointestinal microbiome. We've all lost hundreds, sometimes thousands of species of microbes in the gastrointestinal microbiome. And among those were species that metabolized oxalates. So if you lost those species, most of them lactobacillus and bifidobacterial species, by the way, that metabolize oxalates, you develop an apparent intolerance to oxalates. The solution is not just the avoidance of oxalates. The solution is to rebuild your broken microbiome that includes species and efforts to bring back, to restore species that metabolize oxalates. You know, your great-grandma had none of these problems, whether it's oxalates or FODMAPs or nightshades or histamine-containing foods. She'd think you were nuts if you told her all the foods you can't eat. So add oxalate to that list of foods that there seems to be an intolerance to, not because the food's a problem, but because you disrupted your gastrointestinal microbiome, and the solution is to rebuild, restore those species, in this case, to metabolize oxalates. Another dangerous potential fix, maybe not dangerous and it's going to kill you, but dangerous in wasting your money and time. And that is the people who are saying things like, we can help you live to 140 years of age. We're going to increase longevity. Sadly, almost all of that science does not say you can do that. In fact, a lot of it's fabricated and fraudulent. If you dig deeply into this stuff, you're going to see that all the millions of dollars of products sold to purportedly extend your life do not work because the science it was based on was not science. It was either fabricated or was fraudulent. This is becoming exposed more and more. So, if you could extend your life by 3 months, that would be an unbelievable, huge accomplishment. And these people are claiming you can extend your life by 40 years, 100 years. This is patently absurd. Maybe there's going to be a time in the future when that science is worked out. But the science has not yet been worked out. Not to say there aren't people who make marketing claims to that effect, so be careful. Marketing is not science, and what if the purported science has been fabricated and is fraudulent? So, for instance, $782 million was given to Dr. David Sinclair of Harvard, and he formed a company called Sirtuin Pharmaceuticals to commercialize some of these longevity preparations. Well, nobody could corroborate any of his findings that were being used to support this claim of longevity. GlaxoSmithKline, who wrote that check to Dr. Sinclair, tried to get the money back, but they couldn't prove fraud. So far, they've not been able to get the money back from him. But he persuaded them to support science that clearly could not be corroborated by anybody. He actually said this too. You just take some of these things, most of them are just nutrients that supply material for the Krebs cycle for energy production in mitochondria. He made this claim that if you just take something like NMN, nicotinamide mononucleotide, that all cancer, heart disease, and aging will go away. What? Of course not. What about the effects of diet, the microbiome, vitamin D? I mean, all the other things. You mean one thing that just supplies energy to the mitochondria is sufficient to eradicate all human disease? This is absurd, of course. But many people have spent a lot of money following those false, fabricated, and fraudulent claims. Now, another dangerous fiction, though not propagated so much by influencers as much as the pharmaceutical industry and my gullible colleagues. You likely know, most physicians are gullible. They believe whatever the salespeople tell them. The people come into the office. I had this for decades, right? Good-looking woman in a miniskirt, good-looking guy in a three-piece suit, promising dinner, trips to Orlando, all expenses paid, all kinds of things like that. Well, once again, they did it with the GLP agonist drugs. These are drugs like Mounjaro, Wegovy, etc. So they tell us, inject yourself, in some cases orally ingest these drugs, and you're going to lose a lot of weight. Well, how do they work? Well, they essentially turn off appetite and slow the digestive process so that a little bit of food is satiating. And they work. You do lose a lot of weight. So for instance, let's say you paid $12,000 or whatever, a lot of money, right? For a year's worth of Mounjaro or Wegovy or whatever. You endure the side effects like nausea, vomiting, risk for bad things like pancreatitis, pancreatic cancer, thyroid cancer, etc., bowel obstruction, but you do it. And everything's good, and you lose 40 pounds. What they don't tell you is of those 40 pounds, 10 pounds is muscle. Think about 10 pounds of ground beef on your kitchen table. It's a lot of muscle to lose. So you stop the drug after a year, because most people can't afford that forever. You regain typically 32 to 34 pounds of fat, mostly in the abdomen, and very little muscle. You have much less muscle, and you have more fat. And if we were to look at your blood glucose, your insulin, other factors, you're now more likely to be a type 2 diabetic, pre-diabetic, hypertensive, risk for heart disease, breast cancer, dementia are now greater after the drug than you were at the start. And because you lost so much muscle, your future is much more likely to be dominated by falls, fractures, frailty, and premature death. We have large databases now, like the NHANES and the Epic Norfolk, telling us that people who reduce calorie intake by these methods typically die several years younger. So you paid $12,000 to become less healthy and probably accelerate your loss of independence and early death. Yet that $12,000 went into the pockets of the pharmaceutical industry, pharmacy benefit managers, and probably the clinic or doctors who got a kickback. There's a lot of kickback schemes surrounding the GLP-1 agonist. That's why they're so popular. The doctors, the clinics are making a ton of money by various forms of kickback schemes. And so this is what's happening. So while I'm reluctant to point fingers at influencers, bloggers, etc., sometimes we have to when they get it really, really wrong. Now, if you learned something from this video, I invite you to see my other YouTube videos, of course, my Defiant Health podcast. I have thousands of blog posts on my WilliamDavisMD.com blog. And if you'd like some better support, better guidance navigating these programs, I invite you to join my conversations, many of which are live, like this, on my innercircle.drdavisinfinitehealth.com.